I have this idea. I'd like to build my own Rhodes piano. I've done a lot of work on my studio over the years, and when I'm in here, I prefer to have space away from the computer screen where I can write and record, because I'd find the bottomless internet pit of everything just too distracting for me. There's a lot of gear in here, and I guess I've gravitated toward an analog vintage kind of sound and setup and just vibe for the space. I've already built some pieces in my studio, articulating mic arms, some workstations, sound absorption panels, things like that. And one of my favorite vintage tones is a Rhodes piano. All the gear I've collected over the years, I don't have a Rhodes, but what I have started playing recently is this little Yamaha Reface CP. This is a miniature electric piano with a sound modeling circuit. And what you get with that is a more natural sound than just a sampled Rhodes. There's a nice effects panel. You can drive it a little bit. It got me thinking, I could take this thing apart and rebuild an enclosure around it with new speakers and a bigger keybed, obviously. The keybed on these CPs is very tiny, but the sound engine in this really punches above its weight. I mean, the Rhodes sounds really nice. I'm sure you can hear this evokes that classic Rhodes sound quite well. And when that's run through additional saturations, compression, and other outboard gear, it really comes alive, and I don't think people would be picking it out as a fake Rhodes in a recording. All right, so let's get the back panel off. I want to say before I fully get into this process that, of course, this is not a true Rhodes. There's not metal tines and stuff that are hit by a hammer action key, run through a pickup, and all of the things that gives a Rhodes its character. But this is a really nice starting point to have actually a quality instrument in the studio, and a great foundation to sort of freestyle a project with the limitations of this circuitry. Fair amount of cables, but they're nice and tidy. So I'm going to try to trace out what exactly I'm looking at here once I get the keybed removed, and see if I can just distill this down to the circuitry. So I'm going to unscrew the upper circuit board. This is the primary board for the actual control panel. And here's a look at what exists behind the knobs and faders of that control panel. So I've got some little standoffs here, I realized, that must have fallen off after I unscrewed everything. The standoffs are important to keep. I'll reattach them to the circuit board, and that's what just applies the pressure to the thinner aluminum control panel. I like to drop metal on top of circuitry any chance that I can, so took that opportunity here. So to get this control panel off, this is the aluminum front-facing piece. It's screwed on, but then it also has some adhesive to it. It's just an adhesive coating. It's not really like a tape, but it required me to pry out this panel. I didn't want to put too much tension as I was pulling this, because at a certain point, if you kink the metal too much, you kind of can't undo that again. So I took my time to just free that. You can see how tacky this stuff is. So just be aware, if you do this teardown, that the resistance that you may feel in the aluminum there, it can be easily overcome. Just take your time and peel it in stages. That's basically the entirety of the CP. I want to get a little further into the components that I really need for this piece. I can see the wires that go to this keyboard. I know I'm not going to need this for the build, so we're going to detach that. I'm going to label this just in case something weird happens in the future. Need to access it. And then I'm going to trace out the wiring for the speakers. Those are going away as well. I'm starting to see here that it looks like 3 separate boards, which makes sense. You get the control panel itself, you have the primary sound board, and then you have the board that runs to your ins and outs for the rear panel. So not too bad, although the primary control panel is bound by this really tiny strip of wires it doesn't give you more than like 2 inches of play. We're going to start to take those down a little bit further and separate them from the original unit. So as I mentioned, I'm definitely going to need a new key bed for this piano. And I ended up settling on this M-Audio key station. It's a 61 key, full-size key, controller. Particularly, it has full thickness keys, and it was the most minimal controls available in a MIDI keyboard that I could find. I'm not going to need any real controls for this build. I don't need like drum pads and other faders or anything like that. So this is like kind of the most primitive MIDI keyboard that I could get with a full-size key bed. The signal flow is going to look like this. I'm going to have the M-Audio key station going out via MIDI over to the Yamaha CP. I'll take those left and right outputs over to a DI box. The DI box is going to split the signal off for me. One path is going to go into an internal amp, and then the amp will power the speakers. The benefit of that DI box is I can split that signal, have that path go over to some outboard gear, direct into the recording mixer, whatever it is that I want to do, while also being able to hear the speakers of the unit, and they're independent of the recording circuit. And I did a quick test of that signal path here, just to be sure that it works. Everything looks good, and I can see that I need to just cut away down to the left control panel. That's all that I'm really gonna need. The control panel also is where the ports for the MIDI control information and the power on and off is. I took the plastic housing off of the M-Audio key station, and on the bandsaw, I'm just gonna kind of cut this apart. I'm gonna keep this little left-handed segment. And something I really didn't like about the M-Audio, the keys felt really springy and unnatural. I started doing some research about weighting your own keys, and I came across somewhere that suggested wheel weights. So these are used in the automotive industry. What was nice is like you can add 7 grams at a time. I found that the key kind of maxed out at about 28 grams or so in terms of balance against the spring that comes with the keys. Here I'm going to demo the difference between a weighted key and an unweighted key as I'm making my way up this process. You can see how fast the key springs back when it's unweighted, but with the weight, there's much more heft in that spring back. It's not like a true hammer action. It doesn't have that mechanism, but it feels much more substantial when you're playing. By weighting all the keys, now the bed does not want to sit flat, but we can deal with that at a later stage. I want this key bed to feel right. I want this Rhodes to be, a welcoming instrument in the studio, just the same as my piano. As close to a true vintage electric instrument as I can get it. I need to build an enclosure, around this circuitry, and I'm trying to avoid creating a perfect box shape in order to cut down on reverberation and just frequency spikes, particularly in the low end. So I ended up designing this sort of strange box, a classic look, but there's kind of an odd design going here. In the speaker portion of the enclosure, those are non-parallel walls on both sides. Theoretically, this should cut down on reverberation. I'm also trying to maximize the amount of space that the speaker has to output into, and that will improve the low end a little bit. I'll go into the frequency spectrum analysis and stuff later on. I did check out what the actual frequencies are that are built into this circuitry, so there's some limiting factors as far as that is concerned. The lows were somewhere around 50 hertz or so I will want to get speakers that can replicate that, but there's really no sub harmonics in this, and you're not going to be able to get it out of that either. It's just not actually in the sound modeling. I'm going to add a round over to all of those edges now before I glue the rear panel on. It gives a little bit more of a finished look, even though ultimately this enclosure will be pretty hidden. You may be noticing a variety of tools already in this process that are beyond a typical DIY setup. I own a business building studio furniture for recording studios, so I'm going to use any tool available to me. But the primary elements of this build are pretty basic. You could layer the enclosure any way you wanted. It could just be painted, it could be veneered, it could have glitter epoxy to the entire outer surface. You know, you could just leave it. You could choose to add an amp or not. If you don't, add speakers and an amp. You know, you could just be using the in and outs on the back of this. It's a totally functional panel back here. So regardless of your level of skill, this can still be a worthwhile and fun project to attempt. I took a little time to paint those interior pieces, even though really you're never gonna see the inside of this. So the larger area that the sound pressure has to go, the deeper the low frequencies sound. You can stuff the enclosure with sound wool and stuff like that. You could even cut holes in the bottom of the enclosure, which would allow air to escape and pressure to escape. And before I can proceed with the build, I got to get this box enclosure sort of set up, and then I'll know what my parameters are to work with. It's a tough set of planes to kind of match up here. You've got two opposing angles, but they need to be matched exactly. And I didn't quite nail it. There's a gap here. I must have set the height of the dado blades just a little too high, so they took too much out of the pocket. Not a huge deal though. I just put some scrap to make up the gap there. This will be just as strong as if I had nailed the joint in the first pass. It's all about maintaining the friction and not having air gaps that could allow for vibration. I want somewhere for the key bed to go, and I want to allow as much channeling as I can maintain for cabling. I don't know where cables are going to go. I don't know whether I'm even going to use much of this channeling, but in my experience, if you have an option to make your life easier down the course of a build, especially somewhere that is ultimately going to be hidden, take that opportunity. So I've got two equal height pieces here with a channel cut in the middle, like a trough. And I made just a quick platform here out of some plywood scrap to start to check my key bed on. I'm going to need to square things up eventually on this piece of plywood, so I can really start kind of scrutinizing the height of everything. Do the controls on the left side fit? Does the amp fit? I'm checking the travel of the key with machinist square. The plane that square represents is where I expect the front panel is going to go. So I want to be sure that the key is going to be set just behind that. So I saved the offcut of that M-Audio key station, and there are holes there that align to silos on the underside of the keys themselves. And that's what I want to thread and screw into in order to hold that key bed nice and solid. So the only way to do that is to screw in from underneath. Using this offcut from the actual M-Audio chassis, I'll know that the placement is exact, or should be as close to exact as I can get it. I'm going to deepen the holes with a Forstner bit to allow a spot for those little silos to fall into. There you can see it kind of catches, and we know that everything is lined up. Drill out those holes and put in some screws from underneath and really attach the key bed. I've got my shop assistant helping me with some of these components. I've got this mounted on the wood here. This sort of simplifies part of the rest of the process here, because now I've got it sort of bonded to this wood, and the wood becomes the parameter to design around. So we gotta hide the M-Audio control panel because it's ugly. So on the left side, the M-Audio has a mod wheel and a pitch wheel. I decided to keep those because it might be kind of cool to have some pitch. I really want to be able to switch between the octaves on the key bed there. So I do want to preserve the plus and minus buttons there, the octave shift. And I found a little amp that actually is real similar in dimension to the controls of the mod wheel and the pitch wheel and stuff. So that allows me to build a little box on the left and the right of the actual keys. The height works out from the amp and the controller that those boxes could basically be the same exact size, and that'll kind of frame in the keys as well. So we're gonna make some little boxes here, pretty much equal size boxes left and right, certainly equal size and height, so that everything will look nice and even. And I built these out of a little like craft plywood, like a 1/4 inch ply or something. It's the high quality plies. Now eventually I'm gonna need to conceal the whole front of this, conceal all the plies and obviously the whole box cavern itself. So I wanna give myself as much material to screw something into as possible. You can see I've got access to the plus and minus buttons and the advanced button, the mod wheel and pitch wheel. We're going to be working on those, creating some custom knobs for those mod and pitch wheels. So I'm just kind of gluing in a little bit of trim to make that part of the process down the road easier. And once those plywood boxes are accounted for, we can start getting into like more fun stuff for me as a woodworker, and that is like grain matching and just finding some interesting pieces of wood around the shop. This is a nice piece of walnut that's got some Reflect in it. It's just an area in the wood that absorbs and throws light in different ways. It's just a pretty effect from a natural wood. So what I'm going to do is go with a process called book matching, which is first you resaw a board of any size, and then the offcuts align up to each other and they're mirror images of one another. It's a really lovely process. You see this in old cabinetry and in nice pieces of furniture, consoles. It's a nice area that I can put a little extra detail, because this is going to be the top of the box next to the keybed. You're going to see it. And anyways, this little blank is not super useful in its form for my typical builds for my business. So it's a nice way to use this material and not put it in a burn bin. And I'm going to also cut up one additional set of extra from this blank, just in case I screw something up. Something goes wrong in every build, and you just get better at pivoting from your mistake and preventing them. So get this extra set just in case. Put a little triangle here for the orientation, but if I fold them in on each other, both of those edges exactly the same, so the glue joint will pair up. We got these book matched pieces of walnut squared up at the jointer and a little bit of hand planing, and now I want to make sure that this glue joint is completely tight. So here we've got that middle piece of Peruvian walnut that we just saw, and then we're going to flank those walnut book matched pieces with just some little offcuts of Peruvian walnut. I'm going to do my glue up on a piece of melamine board, but first I'm going to tension the glue joint with tape. This is thicker than a typical veneer. These are pretty thick little panels here, but same process that you would use for other veneer glue ups. I'm going to clean out the joint, make sure there's no debris in there, because that will prevent those little guys from really hugging up flush at the line. Glue them up overnight. Took a couple of the panels out, and we're going to sand them down, take the panels out of our clamps, and try to get these into like a final form that will continue to get shaped down, but we'll have two equal pieces here. So I'm just going to mark them out and on the drum sander. And I'm just going to clean them up after the drum sanding. Take a quick look at the grain orientation here. And here's how these panels are going to look on the keybed. Piano's starting to take a little bit of shape. I've got a demo piece on top of the piano here. This is not going to be my final cut piece, but everything looks good. I want to select some of the wood that I'd like to use in this build. I've got a few different types of walnut. I've got Peruvian walnut. This is an offcut from a much larger slab that was used in the center of a dining table that I built. It's a really beautiful piece of Peruvian walnut. Really nice yellow and amber tones in it. I haven't really found another piece like it. So this is the offcut from there. I knew the tones looked good. The length was not really enough to work into another project. It gives me an opportunity to maximize the materials in my shop. I need to cover the exposed ply on the interior edges of those two control boxes on the left and right of the keys. I'm cutting some little veneer out of that same wood and continuing it down the edge, the vertical edge there. So when I'm playing the keys and depressing the highest and lowest key there, the reveal is still showing just all walnut. So when you're cutting your own wood veneer, there's one simple trick that's going to get you immaculate results, and not many seem to know about this. But if you watch your cut closely, just listen for a moderate explosion. There, that will be your indicator that the veneer is perfect. The gap is pretty tiny between where the control box and the actual physical key is. That's why I'm just going with a little bit of veneer. You'll never see the plywood box. Next to the keys here, I just checked out the reveal is where I want it to be. I do have a ways to go, but it's cool to see this taking shape already into a recognizable form. I'm looking for something unique for the new control panel that I'll be making. Something that's going to contrast nicely with the outer walnut that I intend to use for the rest of the piece. I remembered that I have this material called Valchromat, basically a pressed fiber board, but where all of those wood fibers were dyed before the panel was made. I had a bunch of this dark gray. I think that's actually going to work great against the walnut, but the panel itself is only 24 by 24. So I got to cut 2 strips out and then glue them together at the ends, which is not really the ideal area for a joint. So what I'm going to do is strengthen that joint with 2 dominoes. I need to place them strategically though. They need to be as close to the edges as I can get them, but I can't go too close to the edge because once the angle is cut in the front control panel, I don't want to expose the domino. I really mapped out where those dominoes needed to be placed, knowing that in this next step, when we CNC the control panel section out, that a portion of each of those dominoes is going to be cut. But the dominoes are doing the job I need them to do, bonding those 2 panels together. I can get it, and just is what it is. So as far as mistakes go, hopefully that is not the piece that I've made a mistake on. Once that new Valchromat strip was made, I could CNC this funny shape where I've got a 45-degree taper on the top and the bottom of this to sit at an angle. And I'm also making these little angled pieces that will accept that piece of Valchromat and sort of set the angle. And that whole panel is going to just attach by magnets because I know I'm going to need to reinstall, take out, just move that panel a fair amount, particularly during the build. And I don't want to be screwing and unscrewing and just ruining any kind of threading that's in place. The magnets will hold it completely stable. Getting those magnets in place, I'm going to also add some CA glue to just make sure that they really stay in position. And I can do a final test fit for that junction there. So I'm just marking the position of the magnets on the back of the panel because it was sort of arbitrary where I placed those. I used some tape to just mark the adjoining piece on those angled jig pieces and use a brad point bit to mark out where I needed to drill for the mating magnet to be placed. Then with those locations marked, I'm going to Forstner out a little pocket for that magnet to sit in so that it's got a flush connection. And I can do a final test fit for that little position. It's got such a nice amount of tension in there. Once I knew that that was all looking good, I just want to round over the reveal for the control panel there. Also use this little hand plane to continue that round because the bearing of that router bit was not quite able to complete the round over. I'm gonna start oiling that because it's like a high density material. It accepts a ton of oil. Later I will be lacquering that as well. I picked up this piece of brass angle bar from McMaster because I was going to need something to overhang the upper portion of the keys. I'm using this really just as a visual element. At the top end of those keys, you can see the hollow that goes down to the springs and all that stuff. You don't want to be looking at that on a keybed. I expect to put a strip of felt across that, and the brass bar will be a nice visual component to kind of break up the eye line. On the panel, I wanted to have some wording of some kind. I decided to just stick with Rhodes as the only real wording outside of the what's on the control panel itself. So I just pulled in some fonts in Illustrator and kind of masked those out in a way that I could stagger the letters in between each other, then just cut those out of little scraps of Valchromat in different colors. I'm going to free those letters at this little bandsaw, and I pocketed in the corresponding Rhodes pockets for those letters, and just gonna super glue them into place. The pocket has a lot of tension against the lettering there. I don't want to use the sliders for the mod wheel and the pitch wheel that came with that key station, but I think I could implant some brass controls into those wheels. So I'm going to start shaping the brass. Having not done this before, I just sort of made my way through it. How would one make a knob? And what I'm going to do is take the brass rod, drill out a hole down the center of the rod and thread that, then add corresponding threaded brass rod into that hole and bond it with some Loctite. Metalwork is not my specialty. Electronics and metalwork were two pieces that I rarely get to work with. So in that way, this was like the biggest challenge for me. And even though these knobs are little details in this build, and they could have been done with any other material, I could have done plastic, I could have done wood. I kind of like a little challenge like this that can just be open-ended and more of a freestyled process, particularly when there are elements that I haven't done before. That leaves room for just new design ideas to maybe pop up along the way, and it can make builds like this pretty exciting. I should be able to file off the threads of what's remaining of the brass shaft there for the mod wheel. It'll end up looking like the whole thing was turned at once, like on a lathe, in theory at least. So I'm oversizing these because I need areas to clamp. I need areas to put in the drill chuck. I'm making these a lot taller on both ends, just so I have clamping room, and I don't care if I mar up that extra area of brass. Ultimately, we'll be trimming this down. So I found on the underside of each of those wheels, there's actually kind of like a little cavern, and I poured just a little bit of epoxy into both of those channels so that I have more material to thread down into for the brass rod. This is going to be an awkward process of trying to drill out at the center of each of these wheels where the knobs are going to go. So I've got my clamps doing their job. I have my shop assistant helping by just wedging against the pitch wheel and the mod wheel to prevent it from moving while I drill out this spot. Because these knobs are going to be used and have tension on them, they need to be as strong as possible. And this ended up working really well. Threads, had plenty to bite into because of the epoxy that's beyond the rubber of the wheel. There, as you can see on the modulation wheel, which doesn't have resistance to it, the weight right now from the brass kind of forces it to fall into the lowest position. I think once all of the brass is trimmed down to its final dimension, it won't have so much weight to it. I was calipering elements, keeping notes of those positions to make sure that I'm actually riding along a center plane. So we're going to prep those side control boxes now for the glue up. I use the CNC to cut out the exact positioning of my brass controls. I'm just going to lay that walnut panel down onto the plywood and get that glued up. I'm not worried about expansion and contraction of the wood, gluing it to the plywood in this orientation because it's such a tiny piece. It'll move a little bit, but it's okay. And once that glue up was done, we're just going to clean up the overhangs of that walnut and sand it down at the belt sander, just so we get a nice straight flush edge. And where that transition happens from the horizontal wall down to the vertical wall, it's going to throw on a little tiny round over just so that transition is not so sharp. We can get some oil on those pieces and kind of get them dealt with and out of the way so we can continue on the next. You'll see a little glimpse here of the legs that I built for this piano. And then on our brass knob, so this is the filing process that I was just mentioning. You can see that I obviously was not totally centered for the threaded rod, but it's insignificant enough for this application that it shouldn't be an issue. So those look pretty good, polished up and filed down there, and leaving just enough thread to engage the mod wheel and the pitch wheel. Time to free that brass knob. I sort of felt for what seemed to be the right height and thickness of that upper portion and cut off the longest part of the top of the brass there. So above the mod wheel and the pitch wheel, I also wanted to preserve the octave shifting buttons, as well as the advanced button that came with the key station. So in case in the future I needed to make some kind of adjustment, I wanted to preserve that button so that I didn't have to take the entire piano apart. That was going to be kind of a tricky surface to maintain access to because it is on a little bit of an angle because of the molding of that key station controller area. So I decided to epoxy the buttons. I kind of roughed them up first, put a little epoxy on there, and then I'm going to drop on these knobs that I made out of just some walnut dowels. Sorry they look a little gross. All right, on the top of the Rhodes, I wanted to use some of this offcut of that same Peruvian Walnut board from the dining table. By resawing this, you can split it in half and then cut these little, just sort of like splines almost. I did the math on the surface area that was available to me from these two pieces, made a layout in Illustrator to be sure that I would have enough material to work with and a little bit of extra material in case I made a mistake somewhere. And I also designed in these very minimal slats along the very top of the piano. This will conceal where the speakers are going to go. And I designed a little subtle pattern to those slats. This will allow me to maximize the material out of the Peruvian Walnut. And I create these angled sections in those slats over where the speakers are going to go. I'm hoping that what this will do, I mean, it's just a nice little design detail, but if you're looking at the piano from the right position, you won't see that there's speakers there. You have to be facing directly at the piano in order to see those little carve outs. There's a lot of slats there to work on. So on the CNC machine, I ran those through. I put some chamfer into the programming on the CNC as well, so we don't need to be doing that by hand. Get this little satisfying crack as I pull all these apart from the remaining material. Now I'm just going to free them all at the jointer, and there was really very little waste ultimately from this Peruvian walnut. I was really happy to be able to use this. Just a really pretty piece of wood. Freeing these from the extra material, cleaning up all of just the little bits of like onion skinning with the wood that remained the base of the walnut. So we also made a little jig from the CNC machine, which allowed actually my assistant to sand out all of those slats. We could run the jig itself through the drum sander so that everything got thicknessed appropriately, and then could sand the end grain of each piece as well. And just placing them into the top of this enclosure, I can kind of get an idea of what all these pieces are going to look like. We're just going to put a little water on them here and then get them ready for oil. We use the jig here as well to oil each slat. I do not want to get oil on the underside of these pieces because I need glue surface. So no oil there. The jig allowed me to just kind of batch out the oiling process. I've got a lot of pieces of walnut here to get oiled, and just got into a zone of lining up each batch, getting them coated, making sure, you know, even coverage all the way around. It's a time-consuming process, but also very rewarding. I also mentioned this in the first video. You can see some of the legs here from the base frame of this piano. I will be doing a separate build on that. If you'd like to see that, feel free to subscribe, and if you're into the woodworking stuff, you know, I'll be posting that next. It's good to identify points in a project where you are going to be doing a lot of the same thing and spend the time to make a jig or prepare for that process. If I were to just be like hand oiling each of these pieces, inevitably there'd be oil getting on gloves, and then that would transfer to the underside of the surface that I didn't want to get glue on. This is good practice to prepare for batching if you know that there's going to be a batching element in a project you're working on. So now for the extended glue prep for those slats on the top of the enclosure. I want the enclosure to be black, so I need to paint that black. Probably I should have done that before CNCing the whole thing, but all the same, this works. So I just taped out all of the pockets that are ultimately going to be glued to block the paint from getting to that surface. Didn't need to be exact, it just needs to have enough glue surface area. And I'm just prepping for paint and glue. And we're just going to get that painted black. Just get some black spray paint. You're really just going to see the wood once they're glued into position there, but the black will be a good way to disguise the MDF beneath it. And the paint is set on the top enclosure there. We can start prepping that for glue once all of that tape is removed. This is also a tedious process. I could not do the glue up entirely in one stage, so I decided to focus on some chunks of about like 8 to 12 inches at a time. I wanted to be able to clamp down sections at a time. To glue it all up at once, the glue would have set before I had a chance to get a clamp on everything. So I don't want these things sliding around and coming out of square, especially over the speakers here, because they have a distinct pattern there that I'm trying to preserve. So I've got these pieces picked out, sorted already, and numbered. You can see some of the numbers in the channels there. And this is a sort of awkward one to clamp up, but just adding some weight here, some clamping calls across those surfaces. I know they're all the same height and stuff, so they should all be getting the same clamping pressure. And then I just took my time setting a straight edge here with my level as sort of like a home position. They're all basically identical. Some of them went in a little smoother than others. And the nice thing doing it this way, it's just going up like 3 or 4 channels at a time. You can get those set, you know, tapped into position, then move on, glue up a few more. And I started to hit my stride, you know, and I realized I could actually glue out this whole middle batch. And I was confident that there was enough time to then just add a little bit of weight to all of those for the final clamping. There was a lot of pressure in the channels there, so the friction was also holding them in place. And then I did a little bit of sanding off camera to just smooth out all of the walnut slats. And then we can start getting some lacquer on them before it gets too cold outside. And then before we glue the top on, I want to get all of this circuitry in place. So I've got some little spacers here to knock it off of the wall a bit. I just 3D printed those spacers, but you can buy nylon spacers in any size from hardware stores. And so it's just allowing the circuit board some space with each other there. Some of the limiting factors there are the length of the wires from the circuit board to the actual sound engine. So they have to be sort of oriented in a certain way together in that little tight spot. All right, now we're gonna start working on these speakers. I'm gonna cover those with kind of a heavy duty black speaker fabric. This is a nice material. You can technically see through it, but it's got a few layers of this kind of crisscrossing grid to it. And just to mention about those speakers, this is the lowest possible frequencies in this board. So generally the formant looks like it's beginning around 50 hertz. The first real peak is at about 100 hertz, so 50 is probably the starting point. Everything else below that is just getting too muddy. I found these wonderful Eminence speakers, and they run 50 hertz to about 15K, and they sound crystal clear through that little amp. So it's a perfect combo. I had my daughter come down with her radio to just play some Robin Hood as a background story for a little bit to pass the time. I'm not that familiar with soldering up speakers and stuff. I know that this is like very basic electronics. I'm much more comfortable in the woodshop than I am dealing with any of these electronics. I have since upgraded the solder gun, but did the job. I just took my time. I made sure I was keeping track of the positive and negative. And once everything was soldered in there, I just want to attach the black material to the underside of that top before we get that glued in. So I'm sort of sizing that, trying to tension it with the speaker itself, and then I can staple that remaining material down into the MDF. So the tension is preserved there from the speaker. And here is a point of no return. This is gluing the rabbited edge of the top of this piano with the speakers in place there. You know, I could attach them technically from behind, but it would be very, very tricky after the fact. And also the weight of the speakers adds a little bit of clamping pressure in the interior portions of that box at those joints. So I just got out a bunch of clamps and made sure I was, applying pressure all the way around so that box is really fully sealed all the way around. Any reverberations and vibrations from the speakers, they're not going to vibrate the box. It's a nice tight enclosure. All the leaves have fallen from the trees in the backyard, and I am 8 weeks into this project. I had some trees milled on my property that had come down in a storm, and it left me with lots and lots of boards to deal with over the season. But one thing I also had him do was to cut some thick veneers from this large walnut slab that I had, the majority of which I used in a pretty special mastering disc for a client. These are some offcuts from the veneer in that project. These had a little bit of waviness to them, and in the interest of maximizing all materials in this build, I'm trying to use as much of those leftover veneers as I can. Some of this footage you will see is a little out of order now. The top is not glued on in some of these scenes. I do need a front-facing walnut panel. So when you're facing directly towards the piano from across the room, you will see walnut facing you, and then there's also walnut controls up above. But that front panel needs to be able to come off because I need to run the amp controls through there and just be able to kind of get in there if I need to, instead of deconstructing the entire piano. I'll probably vacuum press them, which I don't get to use a whole lot typically. So in the vacuum press, we just glue up veneer with some kind of slow setting veneer glue and let the vacuum press do its thing. It compresses your veneer down to a flat. I let it sit overnight. It's always fun when you get to integrate one of these into your project. Next morning, kind of unearth the veneer, just take a look at how it turned out. It's nice and flat. There's no cupping or bowing that was a little bit present in those pieces of wood. I ended up doing 2 sets of these. So the very underside front of the piano, which is actually tucked beneath the keybed, is visible, but you kind of have to be at eye level down to that space to see it. I wanted to continue that wood grain just so the color is consistent. And so we got that glued up on this front angle here, and I'm just gonna free that with a pull saw. And then into that other veneer, I CNC'd the positions for the controls on the amp. So I've got volume, treble, and bass controls there. And then where the keys are, I've just got like a little rounded out detail for that transition there. Starting to pile up some oiled up pieces here and making good progress. I machined in some holes here. I'm just going to attach this with little tiny bolts because I want access, you know, to the amp or underneath the key bed. I don't want to have to take the whole piano apart. And these are just some little button cap black oxide bolts. Making sure that the amp controls all move independently and freely without any friction against the wood surrounding them. I needed to felt the top of the keys. The top of the keys themselves are kind of ugly. It just starts to expose where the springs are and stuff, and also just to prevent dust from getting in beneath the keys. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to just put a little pop of color, like a retro color there. So I searched Etsy for different felt options, and I ended up ordering a whole bunch of different rolls, different colors I thought I might go with. I was really happy with this olive green color, which is great. Originally what I wanted was the green and the brass angle and walnut on top of that. So there's sort of like a staged reveal there of color and material. I'm gonna just epoxy the angular walnut strip on top of the brass here. I pre-finished the walnut so that I don't have to do anything else to this section. It would start to get complicated trying to apply finish to wood that's on top of brass, that's on top of felt. Those are all different finishing processes. And just adding some random weight across that to let the epoxy set. All right, next fun part, making our side cheeks for this enclosure to block in the MDF box where the speakers are going and everything. These are really just a visual element, but they define the outer perimeter shape, so they're really important. I had some bowed Peruvian walnut, which is not good for a tabletop or anything, but when you cut them down into segments, you sort of lose the bow there. So they're kind of perfect for this, and there was just enough material in them to mill down and be able to create a left and a right side with all the pocketing that was going to be involved. So first I'm going to template that side piece as I had designed it to just make sure that it looks right on the profile of that box, but also to be sure that I've got enough material, because this is close, it's close. There's a little extra material, not much. So I want to be sure that I'm able to cut out everything that needs to be cut out from what remained of that Peruvian walnut, and I can glue the panels up appropriately, knowing that they are spaced exactly as needed to my template. I'm just going to trace out my template here. I'm also going to make some marks in here of where I plan to place some dominoes. Then before we get that glue up going, I'm just going to hand plane those down to a nice sharp edge so we get a tight glue joint again. These just help square up the glue up. Not totally necessary, honestly, for a piece this size, but I know that I'm going to be hollowing out a side profile into these pieces of walnut, so I kind of want as much strength as I can get, and I try to position those in an area that I know will allow for kind of a little more surface to be shared between each of these boards once that profile is cut. You can see how close to the edge of this wood the profile gets. Inside that little island there is one of the dominoes. It also marks out the side of the control panel, so it will support the left and right sides of that control panel. So it's kind of doing double duty there. These are some of the final elements of this build that need oil and finish. Once these are complete, we are really into the home stretch of the project and starting to feel like I can see the horizon. So for the rear panel, I'm going to use a little bit more of the Valchromat that was used on the front control panel. This is a 1/2 inch piece, a piece that needs to be able to be detached if I need access to any of the wires or the speakers or cables. I designed up a little gridded pattern in Illustrator and positioned the bolts accordingly to kind of disguise where the holes for those bolts are going to go. It's sort of a decorative panel that also allowed me to create the cutouts that I needed for the rear of the Yamaha CP. I particularly wanted to preserve the controls of like the right left output and the sustain and the headphones. So I want access to that. That way I can do some direct out porting if I need to run the piano through other analog gear that I have in the studio, tape machines, saturators, things like that, while also being able to use the speakers at the same time. Using this Valchromat, again, gives me a nice consistent tone, even with all of this grid machined into the back here. And rounded off all of the through holes And then I labeled each of the ports that were going to be available to me on the back of this panel. So I masked off those labels and spray painted black, which I can sand away later, and anything that is painted into the pocket of the label will remain black and a little more visible for me. So before we sand those off, I'm just gonna mark out where I need to add some threaded inserts for the bolts on the back panel. With all the work that was involved in building this, I decided to put my Munster branding on the back panel here. It was built in my Munster shop, so I had carved out a space for that and a little bit of detail about what this is. If I die and somebody finds this piano, they can Google the back of it and find this video. And I'm gonna start running the wiring through and dealing with some finishing touches. On the rear panel, I added this sort of rubber weather stripping across the back panel to mitigate any kind of vibration. Got my DI box in the bottom position, and that is going to be removable as well. So if I need access to those through ports on the back there, or changing a setting on the DI box after the amp, I'll have access to it. I ended up just gluing in these little blocks of walnut, and those are placed using the circuit board to find the correct alignment for the screws that I need to put in place to hold that control panel there. I'm going to do a friction fit on the overall power switch. That switch goes to a small power strip that is actually located with the piano. So it actually controls an entire strip, which allows the keybed to turn on and also allows the circuit boards and the speakers to turn on. Everything is still accessible theoretically. Like if I needed to make adjustments in the circuit board and wiring and stuff, I can get in there, but it's tight. I managed to hold on to all of the knobs and washers and nuts over 5 months, and having them labeled in a bag and not losing track of them. So I got those all attached. Get the main key bed platform screwed down into the final position there. I can get the front walnut set up. There's a nice look at the reveal for the amp knobs. They're really tucked nice off to the side there. This started to feel like it was coming home here. So I've got the brass elements threaded into the mod wheel and the pitch wheel. And here's some of the first sound out of this structure here. Pitch wheel and the modulation works. So I'm going to add the remaining threaded inserts for the side cheeks of the piano and get everything attached. It's a nice snug fit. I'm going to run all of my cabling through. I've got wires coming out of the enclosure and going back in that go into that DI box. This was sort of the best solution I had to keep those original in and out ports accessible. We'll plug in our left and right. And the final detail, I added little LED strip lighting to the bottom of the piano. This will downlight the piano legs when the entire unit is on. We can finally take a look at this new instrument. This was a really fun build, and I'm considering making some type of plans for at least the basic enclosure around this piano. If you're interested in doing this type of project at all, let me know, and maybe that'll encourage me to create some more approachable plans.